The year is 1849, at the height of what was known as the California Gold Rush. The place is the California Trail, specifically where it crossed the vast sagebrush and alkali desert of Nevada. To hordes of gold hunters heading for the newly opened California gold mines, there was no part of the route that was as dangerous. Not only were there few sources of water, but according to the diaries and letters left behind by these gold hunters, the desolate land was filled with what they often called treacherous savages, bands of horseless northern Paiute, Bannock, and western Shoshone Indians. In these travelers' diaries, their letters, their journals, which served for generation after generation as the sources of what the white man knew about the North American Indians, they were described as, quote, wretched, degraded, and despicable, and, quote, the meanest Indians in existence, who hid by day but came out at night to sneak into their camps and steal food and livestock. You can imagine these gold hunters and these wagon cover these stagecoach riders hunkered down in fear of what they called savages, shooting sometimes blindly into the darkness when they heard a sound. Sometimes in the morning they would find the body of an Indian, sometimes a child, a woman, or an elder. All the more proof that they were all thieves, regardless of age or sex. Now, of course, from the Indian side, the story was completely different. It didn't make it into the history books at first, which is a major problem of the sources that we're left with, relying so much on the accounts of the white men and women who traveled to California. Although a few later survivors told the stories. These so-called skulking thieves and murderers were in fact hungry and terrified Indian families trying to get safely across a road that the white man had unknowingly cut directly through territory where for centuries the Indians had lived, gathered food, and held their ceremonies. Hiding behind sagebrush by day, they would attempt to slip across this, quote, road at night to get food and see their relatives. In short, the people that the travelers cursed as the, quote, meanest Indians in existence were men, women, and children trying to survive on their own land. Now, what do we make from all this? There are two competing narratives, two stories laid one on top of each other. You look at this map right here of the California and Oregon trails, and you can place right on top of it the map of the growing United States of America as Americans spread westward and conquered the lands to the west. On top of this, you can place a different map, a different world, representing the tribes, societies, nations, families, and people who had the indigenous peoples who had inhabited this continent for tens of thousands of years before the arrival of Europeans. This is a dramatic representation, example, of the kind of multiple narratives of American history and history in general. But this is also the story about which stories come to dominate, which shape our understanding of the past, and which are subsumed, dominated, or even lost. And this double history is not unique. In fact, the stories and the narratives that we hear, these tragic encounters in the night, could serve as a microcosm of the entire history of the white man's encounter with Native Americans going back to the first Europeans in the hemisphere. So this first lecture here is called Colliding Worlds, where we're going to take a look at all the different universes and worlds and cultures that are going to be colliding and coming together in what happens on the two continents of the Americas. It has been very difficult to overcome the historically pervasive and long-enduring gap in our knowledge, a gap with roots that go back to Christopher Columbus's initial arrival and what the Europeans perceived as the barbaric virgin wilderness of what they called the New World. These stories on the California Trail and the stereotypes and the images are reproduced, encounters that are reproduced over 350 years, in which Native Americans are depicted as barbaric and savage in comparison with the conviction of Europeans. An ingrained conviction on the part of those who came from Europe and later from the United States that their cultures, their values, their religions, their lifeways, abilities, and achievements were more advanced and of a higher order than the Indians, who were deemed to be inferior peoples, perhaps in some cases even subhuman, and their cultures irrelevant or barbaric and dangerous to what Europeans perceived as civilized peoples. Everything about the history of what will become the United States eventually starts with land, with the concept of land, with what land is for who owns it and possesses it. It's another example of the European perspective. So Europeans believed that the Indians were often wasting what they referred to as virgin land, that is empty land, land to be conquered. Europeans believed that land needed domination with European farming models. One of the terms Europeans had for the Americas was the quote, New World. In fact, the Americas was a very ancient world, inhabited by a bewildering array of tribes, kings, soldiers, slaves, farmers, men, women, children. Over the past decades, archaeology and other scholarship has demonstrated that the Americas were densely populated. By 1491, the population is estimated to be at perhaps 100 million people in North and South America, 20% of which were living in what we would come to call the North American continent. These large and growing populations have been attributed to two major factors: a relatively disease-free environment and diet. Now, the first fact to be aware of in this class is that this course begins at a point in time in which the population of the planet Earth practically lived in two completely separate worlds. What do we call these sides of the globe? The Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere. Both of these parts of the world were populated with civilizations that have deep and ancient roots. Both developed vibrant languages and cultures, fought endless wars, created religions, had babies, ate food, practiced their cultures. Millions and millions of people over countless ages lived lives: mothers, fathers, farmers, warriors, priests and priestesses, kings and queens, merchants, thieves, and so on. And for at least 15,000 years, at least, people on these two sides of the world knew absolutely nothing about each other's existence. Think about that. And once they did become aware of each other, as we'll see, it didn't just change the history of the Western Hemisphere. It changed the history of the entire world. We could say that the year 1492 then is the most significant event in world history for this reason. In fact, we might say that it was the real beginning of world history. As far as humans' consciousness was concerned, there was no such thing as world history, as a global history, until these two sides of the world finally came into contact with each other. So let's start with the Western Hemisphere before 1492. So this is the world that will ultimately become the founding place of what we call the United States. As we said, that we often talk about Christopher Columbus having discovered the America, which is kind of a very unusual thing to say when a person comes to a place where there are already upwards of 100 million people already living there. And who were these indigenous peoples of the Americas? Right away, anyone who attempts to speak about, especially in general terms, that we are the original inhabitants of the Americas, quickly runs into a linguistic quicksand. The most well-known problem is the term that we often use to describe these vast and diverse peoples: Indians. As you all are probably already aware, Indian is a complete misnomer based on the fact that Christopher Columbus believed he had arrived in Asia, in the East Indies. And that name, because of the power dynamic that Europeans had, that name stuck. It's a complete misnomer, though. It doesn't refer to how these indigenous peoples saw themselves, how they talked about themselves, and how their cultures were reflected. The problem was meant to be solved in the 1960s and 70s by the adoption of the term Native Americans, which has benefits over the term Indians, but also has some historical anomalies to it in the fact that these two continents were not called America. No one living here before the arrival of Europeans referred to their world as America. That's a European invention. So historically speaking, both Indian and Native American are extremely remote from the way the indigenous peoples of these continents thought about themselves. This was the immense continent of North and South America. And here I'm showing you a picture just of North America and the diversity of nations and tribes that inhabited this part of the world. These continents offered extraordinary climatic and environmental diversity. People living along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, on the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains, in the interior desert, on the edges of the Canadian Arctic, or in temperate forests had to pursue different survival strategies and adopt different style life cycles and sets of plants and animals. As this happened, these groups became distinguished culturally, developing different languages, rituals, mythic stories, kinship systems, and survival strategies. And it's crucial to realize right up front the immense diversity of these different cultures and these different societies that existed here. The people of just North America, as you see in this map right here, spoke at least 375 distinct languages by the year 1491. The process of differentiation proceeded most elaborately on the Pacific Northwest and California, reflecting the great differences in the environment. In this area, by the time of the encounter between Europeans and the indigenous peoples, there were 500 culturally diverse communities speaking at least 50 distinct languages. But cultural differentiation on these continents did not mean isolation. So just as in the case of the Eastern Hemisphere, trade networks developed over vast distances in the Western Hemisphere. Archaeologists have found evidence of items moving hundreds, even thousands of miles up and down the North American continents and in between different cultures. So just as in other parts of the world, human beings engaged in trade and networks of contact. One example of diffusion was the spread of agriculture and horticulture technology. Through trial and error over many generations, horticulture evolved from the practices of gathering wild plants. Wherever this happened in the world, it was a revolutionary event. As some Indian bands protected, watered, and harvested productive patches of wild plants with edible seeds, they gradually developed hybrids of increasing reliability and productivity. For example, wild maize was a single inch-long ear with just 50 kernels and completely inedible. By 1500 BCE, Indians in central Mexico had learned how to cross maize with other grasses to create multiple ears, protective husks, and cobs with multiple rows of kernels, which became a staple of Native American indigenous foods. The Indians of central Mexico pioneered the three great crops of North American horticulture, that is maize, squash, and beans. These are enormously high in nutritional value, and they were diffused widely across both North and South America. As these became more important to their diet, they devoted less time to hunting, to gathering, and to fishing. And indeed, the expansion of cleared fields and the growth of human population reduced the habitat for wildlife. So horticulture or agriculture expanded food supply, permitting a renewed surge in population and a more sedentary life in larger and more permanent villages. Maize, what we call corn, demands permanence, for unless carefully tended, crops succumb to pests, to weeds, and to drought. And the less time devoted to hunting then promoted economic diffusion and economic differentiation, social stratification, enabling some to specialize as craftsmen, traders, priests, and rulers. This is what food supply does. When you have a reliable source of supply and you have a more predictable source of supply, there's less need for everyone in a population to spend time hunting and gathering. And then there can be specialization, and those are the building blocks of what we come to call civilization. However, as a general trend, the Native Americans were slow to develop horticulture. So by 1500 BCE, the Southwest and the Midwest were cultivating maize and squash, but only as a supplement to hunting. And it was not until 700 or 1200 CE that these became fundamental to the diets of these peoples. Crucially, the Americas had few domesticated animals. The biggest example in North and South America was the llama in the Andes. The llamas produced good wool, but could not be milked, ridden, or used for a plow to pull a plow. So the next important domesticated animal was the turkey, which is very important to the Aztecs. Indeed, all of the large animals had long since gone extinct, and those that were left were unsuitable to domestication. What the Americas did have was space, lots and lots of space. So all along the Atlantic coast, uh, tribes practiced burning to recycle the land to attract more game. So Native Americans managed the land through clearing, through burning. This was, a form of eco management. Burning reinvigorated the grasslands, attracting bison to the prairies, and that created unbelievable numbers of herds and their critical role in Native American civilizations. There was urbanization, there was migration, and vigorous communication and trade, even across linguistic lines. So, Mesoamerica, what today includes Mexico and parts of Central America, was for a millennia at least 1,000 years, a cultural hub from which people migrated from the north and from the south. The first great cultivators of corn were the Maya, whose priestly nobility class governed a large region of villages and cities in collusion with a distinct commercial class. And religion was often built around the cultivation of corn. The Mayan people developed art, architecture, sculpture, and painting, and employed a variety of materials, including gold and silver, which they mined and used for jewelry and sculpture, but not for currency. Surrounded by rubber trees, they invented the rubber ball and court and ball games similar to modern soccer. Their achievements in mathematics and astronomy are the most impressive. By the year 36 BCE, they had developed the concept of the number zero. They work with numbers in the hundreds of millions and use extensive dating systems, making possible both the observations of the cosmos and their unique calendar that mark the passage of time into the future. Modern astronomers have marveled at the accuracy of the Mayan charts of the movements of the moons and planets, which were used to predict eclipses and other events. And Mayan culture and science, as well as government and economic practices, were influential all throughout the region. By 1425, Mayan power had been eclipsed by the Aztecs of Tenochtitlan, who had formed a military alliance with numerous people known as the Triple Alliance in Central America and overthrew the major powers and proceeded to wage a war of conquest throughout the Valley of Mexico. The Aztec goal was to, quote, bring all the peoples of Mexico under their own tributary authority. And it's important to know that these events paralleled ones that we see in Europe and Asia during the same period, when Rome and other city-states were demolished and occupied by invading Germanic peoples, while the Mongols of Eurasian steppe overran much of Russia and China. So just as in Europe and Asia, the invading peoples in Central America assimilated and reproduced civilization. Further down in South America, the Inca Empire was located in the Andes Mountains, in modern-day Chile and Peru. It drew inspiration from earlier Andean people, like the Chavin, the Moche, the Mazca, and the Chimu, and controlled over 25,000 miles, ruling over 10 million people. According to one historian, the Inca controlled the largest empire in the world by 1491, larger than the Ming Dynasty of China, the Ottoman Empire at its apex, the Songhai Empire in Africa, and certainly anything that Europe had to offer in 1491. Unlike the Aztec, the Inca created a complex bureaucracy to govern and assimilate conquered people, and believed their emperor was a god ruling by divine right as the son of the sun. The state owned all the land and resources, and the empire was divided into 80 provinces, each with its own governor. Subjects were grouped into units and ruled by local officials. Inspectors kept track of births, deaths, marriages, taxes, and military services using an intricate recording system called quipus, or talking knots. So what you see right here is a reproduction of talking knots. This isn't a headdress or a piece of clothing or decoration. This is a record-keeping system where the knots themselves represent records of everything from births to marriages to taxes. In the Inca Empire, conquered peoples were taught to speak Quechua, the Inca language, and taught to assimilate, were allowed to keep their gods, but expected to also worship the major Inca gods. We see troves of turquoise artifacts found related to the trade of other um, indigenous groups with the Inca. Um, Looking at North America, it's important to note that even though the major empires of the Aztecs and the Inca by 1491 were located in South America, North America had thriving and developing centers of civilization. Uh, Turquoise, for example, has been found in Kansas, Nebraska, areas all around the Great Lakes. We may think of the current U.S. Southwest as the northern periphery of the Aztec regime, and representing the Aztec expansion into North America. Further north, we find the Hohokam, who were between 900 and 1450 CE. They built 800 plus miles of canals, the most extensive irrigation network in the world at that time. Meanwhile, the Anasazi, who were the ancestors of the Pueblo, created an extensive road network in the Four Corners region. Like other groups before Columbus, the Anasazi practiced irrigation, turning deserts into fields of corn and squash. And long before the great Gothic cathedrals of Europe, Anasazi architects were building fantastic kivas in the desert that could hold up to 500 people. Present-day Illinois, where the Mississippi, the Illinois, and Missouri rivers all merge, was one of the most fertile zones in North America, and home to one of the largest groups in North America, the Mississippians, or the Mound Builders, who flourished there 3 centuries before Columbus in great swaths from the Great Lakes to Florida. By the time of the first European arrival, these cultures were in decline, and their great cities such as Cahokia appeared to North Americans to be natural mound formations. We don't know what the Mississippians called themselves or what languages they spoke, but we do know that for a time they were tremendously successful farmers and traders. Indeed, their growth and civilization was based on the cultivation of corn. Like their Mesoamerican predecessors, they built substantial towns around central plazas that featured earthen pyramids topped by wooden temples residing as residence for chiefs. The sun was considered the most important deity, and enormous rituals, including human sacrifice, occurred there. Local chiefs paid tribute to paramount chief in a system of hierarchy. The largest and wealthiest of these ceremonial centers in North America was Cahokia, located near the Mississippi River in Illinois, just east of St. Louis, Missouri. Rising in the middle of broad and fertile floodplain and extending over 350 square miles. It was developed between 900 and 1100 CE. Cahokia and its immediate suburbs covered about 6 square miles with a population of at least 10,000 and could be even upwards of 40,000. Even at its smallest, Cahokia was the greatest Indian community of north of Mexico. And at its peak, it contained about 100 earthen temples and burial mounds and hundreds of thatched roof houses for commoners. The city was surrounded by a stockade, a wall of large posts, 2 miles in circumference with watchtowers, and another structure which has been nicknamed Woodhenge by archaeologists seems to have been a calendar device. Now, during the 12th century, Cahokia was in decline, abandoned in the middle of the 13th century. Although in decline, Mississippian culture remained into the post-Columbus period. So in a Spanish expedition in 1540, commanded by Hernando de Soto, was impressed by the size, scale, and extent of these mound cities. Soto claimed that he could command the sun and summoned a paramount chief to his camp. The chief was himself unimpressed and insisted on Soto's respect and tribute. Europeans often ignored what evidence they have that Indian societies were very old and had a long history of development. When they would find large mound buildings and sites and abandoned cliff dwellings that were often ignored by Europeans. Indeed, Cahokia mounds were ignored even when they were found in 1848. Since Indians were supposedly incapable of such accomplishments, Europeans assumed that this had been the construction of some lost race of Europeans, maybe Vikings, or some mythic kingdom. But certainly they must have been Europeans. And this was the perception that Europeans had of the sense of cultural superiority. So as I want you to recognize as we move into studying the encounter between Europeans and others in North America, it's a really dangerous to paint these diverse cultures with too broad a brush. Nevertheless, we can make some very broad generalizations about cultural similarities. I also want you to be considering what the whole concept of civilization means. Who defines the term civilization? You're going to see this is incredibly important for understanding the way that the United States is founded and the justifications of Europeans for the settling and the colonization of the Americas is this definition of civilization. But I want to make some broad generalizations about some cultural similarities across indigenous populations by 1491 that are useful for understanding how and why they fared the way they did upon the arrival of Europeans. So despite the advance of agriculture, many indigenous peoples in North America, especially, still depended on seasonal hunting and gathering, mixed with some horticulture. So that meant that for their lifeways and the cultural rhythms of their societies depended on having lots of room for hunting and gathering. Similarly, broadly speaking, indigenous societies were relatively physically healthy and disease-free, especially when compared with societies of the Eastern Hemisphere, as we'll see. This was due to many things, including the environment and also the high nutritional content of those three sister staples of food, the squash, corn, or maize, and beans. And, of course, the relatively disease-free society of the Western Hemisphere. Other similarities across North and South America is the lack of the wheel. Few beasts of burden because of the lack of large mammals to use as work animals in agriculture. And metalwork was extremely limited, often just to copper, gold, or silver. There was the Native American religions are vast and diverse, but one of the commonalities that you'll see across North America is a kind of belief in animism. That is that the natural world is suffused with spirits and animated by spirits. So this gave a kind of a preciousness to the natural world, whether it's trees or rocks or streams, that there were spirits all around, a kind of a polytheistic way of looking at religion. And finally, there were very different ideas about what we call ownership or property that are become very significant when we move into the period of the collision of cultures that we're about to get to. There was a broad sense of a kind of very different ideas about what it meant to own property, or especially for an individual to own property, and very importantly, the way that this applied to land. So the concept of owning land, that an individual person or even a society itself could own the land rather than just be caretakers of the land or part of the land, was something very different than what Europeans will believe when they arrive. So keep these in mind as we move forward to taking a look at other parts of the world. Speaking of which, we turn our attention now to the other half of our divided world, and ultimately particularly Europe, as it was before the year 1492. Now, it is true that Europe is going to emerge as the central power in our story over the course of this class and be one of the foundations for the United States. But in 1400 or even 1491, if you were looking down from above, say you were an alien arriving from another planet to find out what are the big powers of the planet Earth, you'd be forgiven if you didn't think Europe amounted to much. As we saw, the empires of the Americas would have appeared much more impressive than even the largest urban centers in Europe. In 1491, Europe's dominance still laid long in the future. Looking down from above, an alien would most likely conclude that China ruled the world, and rightly so. In the 15th century, the Ming dynasty of China was restoring China's power after a long period of domination by the Mongols and decimation by the Black Plague. Under the Emperor Yongle, China reestablished Confucian-based government, eliminated all signs of foreign rule, moved the capital to Beijing, restored farmland, rebuilt the infrastructure, supposedly planted 1 million trees, and built up the economy both domestically and in foreign trade. The Ming rulers were not shy about letting everyone in the region understand who was in power. China's renewed stature was on display in the 28 years of maritime voyages beginning in 1405, led by the famous Zheng He. The goal was to assert China's prestige throughout the Indian Ocean world, not to conquer territory, to spread Chinese culture, or even to gain control of foreign markets. You would not even have ranked Europe as a second power center. That position would likely have gone to the Islamic world, which in the 15th century extended across North Africa and into Spain, east into Central Asia, India, and beyond. Muslim power was diffused through 4 large land-based empires: the Safavid Empire in modern Iran, the Mughal Empire in present-day India and Pakistan, and the Songhai Empire in West Africa. And beginning in 1362, the Ottoman Empire, centered in modern Turkey. The Ottoman Empire was the heart of the Islamic world and lasted up all the way until 1918. It was founded by Turkic warriors from the Anatolian Peninsula, extremely diverse culturally and religiously, they dominated trade in the Mediterranean and Red Sea region. They were matched only by Ming China and the Incas in South America in terms of size and wealth. Ottoman sultans claimed the title of caliph, and Turks claimed to be the strong sword of Islam. They were the dominant power in the Middle East and would eventually conquer Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire, and then laid siege to Vienna in 1529. With the capture of the Asian hub of Constantinople and its change into the Ottoman capital, the Ottomans dominated the old restored trade routes in Asia and had an understandably hostile attitude towards the merchants of the Mediterranean Sea. These routes were heavily taxed. So this was of paramount significance because if any single element bound the entire hemisphere from Europe to Japan together into one identifiable system, it was trade. Trade was the major, perhaps the major factor connecting an unbelievably diverse cultures and civilizations of this giant mass that we call Asia. The Silk Road, established during China's Han Dynasty between 200 BCE and 200 CE, was a 4,000-mile trade route that spanned the Asian landmass, connecting the trade ports of China to the Mediterranean Sea. It's got its name from the incredibly lucrative trade in Chinese silk. But silk was not at all the only item moving across this route. Early on, traders in the Chinese ports of Canton bought silk, porcelain, perfumes, tea, sugar, precious metals, and eventually drugs. Over the centuries, the Silk Road evolved into a vast and varied transcontinental highway system connecting all the major centers of the Eastern Hemisphere. And so there were spurs that linking the main route to the Indian Ocean, where maritime traders brought spices from the East Indies, which we call Indonesia today, including pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, cardamom, ginger, and turmeric. Another spur connected the route to India, which fattened the spice trade and also added precious stones, cotton, and sugar. By the time of the emergence of Islam in the 7th century CE, these trade networks connected China, the East Indies, and India to Persia, to Arabia, to Egypt, and the center of the former Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. Furthermore, the Silk Road land route was linked to a vast and sophisticated series of maritime routes centered on the Indian Ocean. This increased the traffic and flow of wealth and goods. It also connected the system to the East African coast, including lucrative commodities like gold, ivory, and slaves. By the 13th century, then, we have this vast, complex system of trade integrating all the major centers of the Eastern Hemisphere. And although trade was the main thing connecting here, these connections also facilitated the movements of people, cultures, religions, languages, and so on. So for over 1,000 years, the Silk Road was a major factor shaping Asia, Africa, and European life. And the Indian Ocean was the center. So if you were a merchant doing business at any point along this massive highway, what would you be concerned about? You'd be concerned about who controlled these routes, who controlled the routes to the fabulous goods in the markets of China and the East Indies. And here we have to talk about Islam. Islam emerged in the 7th century, usually dated to 622 CE, founded by Muhammad in the western part of the Arabian Peninsula. This area, including Mecca and Medina, was a trading center, and Muhammad himself was a trader. This is one of the factors that explains the incredible spread of Islam in just over a century. Expanded from Arabia along the well-established trade routes, trade facilitated religious and political power throughout the Middle East. By 750 CE, Muslim rulers were in power from the west lands of India to the Iberian Peninsula, or what would later become Spain and Portugal. And political control strengthened economic controls as the caliphates and the later Islamic empires promoted trade and used those routes as a tax source. Complicated and often contentious relations emerged between the power centers in the emerging Europe and the Muslim rulers, particularly in Iberia, which was known by the Muslims as El-Andalus, and on the frontiers of the beleaguered Byzantine Empire. So with the Asian heartland under the rule of multiple and shifting Islamic polities, trade continued in the Mediterranean, but there was a new dynamic of tension that had a profoundly political and religious dimension to it. We don't have time to go into the extremely important phenomenon, but at the beginning of the end of the 11th century and lasting for 200 years, there were a series of religious wars between the emerging European states and the Muslim states called the Crusades. Now, the Crusades shaped the cultures of Europe, shaped the European vision of the outside world, and linked religious conquest with economic conquest of the trade routes. And you can see this most demonstratively in the Iberian Peninsula, or what would later become Spain and Portugal. In this part of the world, a long series of wars were fought between the small Christian kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula and the Muslim polities and Muslim caliphates over a period of, as you see in this chart, of over 500 years, as Christian kingdoms sought to push the Muslims further and further out of the peninsula. So you can see the breakdown here pushing southward until by the time we get to 1480, the Muslim power only exists in that small little portion of Granada, and will finally end when Christian kingdoms push the Muslims out in 1492, which is, of course, a very momentous year. This is going to be important, so think about this. 500 years of crusades and the Reconquista and the religious zealousness that's being attached to conquest among emerging Christian kingdoms in Europe. Meanwhile, Arab traders also dominated the ocean around the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. In dhows, these small ships, trading ships, they carried spices and silks from China and the Indies to Egypt and the Arab markets in exchange for manufactured items like textiles. Slavery, too, was also a big part of this ocean trade. Now, to bring us up to speed historically and set the context for the important things happening in the 15th century, I want to focus on just quickly on two major events that shook the system in the 13th and 14th centuries. The first was the Mongol invasions of Asia from 1207 to 1360 CE. And when I say invasions, I really mean it. Led by Genghis Khan, the Mongols came out of Central Asia in a wave of violence and terror that shook all the established civilizations and cultures of the day. The Mongols, or the Golden Horde, expanded all over the continent, shaking up everything and establishing the largest empire ever seen in Eurasia. The major points about this is that the Mongol conquest disrupted the old political control of trade. They took control and brought a new kind of stability and established an economic and diplomatic relations with the West. After their collapse, they left a huge political power vacuum after their disintegration. The second major hemispheric event was called the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. It originated in China and spread east along the Silk Road, carried in the fleas living on black rats that infested merchant ships until it reached Europe. The Black Death reduced the world's population by 100 million people, including about one-third of the Middle East and perhaps 50% of the population of Europe. The consequences of the Black Death were that it profoundly disrupted the societies and cultures of the hemispheric system. And along with the Mongols' rise and fall, the plague created chaos all along the trade routes. It inspired religious, political, social upheavals, and the rise of small regional states in Europe and elsewhere. So this brings us to the 15th century, when the Ming China and the Ottoman-dominated Muslim world were both recovering from their previous traumas. Now, you might be asking at this point, or maybe you've been asking all along, what does any of this have to do with the history of the United States? And that's a very good question. Importantly, what we're doing here is setting the context for what becomes the fusion of the Eastern and Western hemispheres. And this has to do with the desires and drives and motivations of what we're calling emerging Europe. Now, in this period, just like China and the Mongols, the small kingdoms and the fledgling empires of 15th century Europe were rebuilding after the devastation of the Black Plague. They were entering a period of momentous transformation. But in 1400, or even 1491, the coming dramatic expansion of European power, wealth, and knowledge seemed highly unlikely, as the kingdoms and empires of Europe were populated by an insulated people that had been preoccupied with their own internal and seemingly endless wars that had broken out. The wars of the Crusades were a kind of extension of what had been endless wars among the peoples of Europe. Europeans were also facing their own kind of agricultural revolution. So the agricultural revolution in Europe was based on the cultivation of wheat, rye, grain. More importantly, Europe combined farming with animal husbandry, that is, making animals work and do the plowing, as was not the case in the Americas. This was important because livestock provided manure for fertilization and ecological reserves. Horses, pigs, sheep, cows, and goats domesticated the European landscape. It's also important to realize that it's ahistorical and anachronous to think about the idea of a European as someone who considers themselves to be European. That concept didn't exist in the way that people saw their identity. In the continent of Europe, people saw themselves as French, as Portuguese, as Spanish, as Germanic, and maybe even smaller on the village level. That's how they identified. And so there was no sort of fusion of European identity. In fact, a big part of the creation of European identity will be the expansion of Europeans outside of Europe, when they'll begin to see themselves as having more in common with each other through expansion and colonization and conquest. To this point, Europeans had shown very little interest in science and technology, at least compared with the rest of Asia. Their spiritual and intellectual leaders insisted that everything worth knowing was already available in the Bible. And that represented the power of the church, of the Christian Catholic Church. To the medieval mind, the Christian world was being hemmed in by the superior wealth, power, and technology of the Muslims to the east and the south. And there was a sense that Christians were on the losing side of history, having spent 3 centuries in the Crusades trying to hold on to Jerusalem and losing to the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. This is the kind of medieval mindset that we need to understand when we get to the verge of 1492. On the other hand, These small polities in Europe were in transition, learning how to effectively tax citizens in order to strengthen government, to build infrastructure, to maintain strong professional armies. Near nonstop war on the continent and competition spurred military and technological innovations, including sailing vessels. Parts of Europe, particularly Italy, were experiencing a very conscious cultural awakening that they called the Renaissance, based on new classes of wealthy merchants, art patronage, and the rebirth of Greek and Roman culture. This flowering of culture included a new boom in the demand for luxuries, especially food. European leaders concluded that the Muslim power fed on the wealth they generated by their control of those lucrative trade routes. And the popular literature also reinforced the longing for a way to the fabled riches of the Far East. So, with the printing press, books proliferated with tales of the Orient, what they called the Orient, that is real and fictional. European monarchs and traders were determined to dominate the spice trade. And European visionaries longed to reach the Far East, to enlist the peoples and wealth in a final crusade against Islam, which was all that stood between them and their dreams. So expansionists found their dreams' best possibility in the southwest, on the Iberian Peninsula, where the kingdoms of Aragon, Castile, and Portugal had been very gradually rolling back the Muslim Moors. The Reconquista is the essential context for understanding the so-called discovery of the New World. It was inseparable from this tremendous drive to find a way to circumvent Muslim power on the Silk Road trade routes. And the Kingdom of Portugal shared in this spirit of conquest, zeal, and competition. So the Reconquista, the long military process of state building through plunder and conquest, all in the name of Christianity, spawned two important kind of social groups. First was a very militant clergy. So the idea of a clergy that was linking the idea of their religion and the belief in God and Christianity with militantism. This is built up over 500s of the Crusades. So there was an element of conquest that had entered into the sort of ideology and the teachings of this militant clergy. Another really crucial group was known as the Hidalgos. This was an ambitious warrior class of Spanish-speaking peoples and Portuguese in the Iberian Peninsula. They were an ambitious warrior class because they kind of were a middling class. They weren't the extreme peasantry, and they were not the nobility. They were very ambitious to rise, okay, and that kind of spurred their action for conquest. Aside from some Viking probings, the Portuguese were the first Europeans to make forays out into the Atlantic Ocean. And what was their objective? The objective was to navigate around Africa to bypass Muslim control of trade routes on the land routes. For this objective, they found support from monarchs who also had wanted to bolster their power by tapping into the wealth of the trade and adapting naval techniques culled from the Arab world. So this brings us up to the year 1492. In the 15th century, the focus of European trade was on how to circumnavigate Muslim control of the ancient trade routes to the east. That's kind of why I went over that in detail. The power centers in Eastern Europe, in the Eastern Hemisphere, and the sort of relative position of Europe in terms of this. This is all really crucial because no one at this point knows anything about the Western Hemisphere. No one knows the Americas even exist, and that the indigenous peoples and kingdoms of the Americas exist across the Atlantic Ocean. The interest of Europeans was in the East. It was in the wealth and power that could be attained by having control over these trade routes. And this is really crucial because it underpins the whole motive for expansion that begins in the late 15th century. The Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula had opened up the western mouth of the Mediterranean to Christian shipping at the same time that Turkish conquest tightened control over the eastern Mediterranean. So mariners in northwest Italy, principally in Genoa, were inspired by the possibilities of bypassing these Muslim lands. So how did they do it? The big breakthrough was a technological one. The development in the 15th century of the caravel, a hybrid vessel invented by Iberian and Genoese shipbuilders that was more solid than ancient Mediterranean vessels, but also more maneuverable. If sailors were to navigate into the stormy waters of the Atlantic Ocean, they needed ships that were able to sail directly into the wind, and the triangular lateen sails were the ticket. For this objective, Prince Henry the Navigator found support for a major naval school in Portugal, adapting naval techniques that were culled from the Arab world. With these new sailing vessels, Iberian and Italian mariners began probing all along the northwest coast of Africa, early on landing on 3 sets of islands in the eastern Atlantic: the Canaries, the Madeiras, and the Azores. From these outposts on those islands in the Atlantic, Iberian monarchs sponsored explorations down the northwest coast of Africa. As this map is showing you, you can see the routes that are coming out of the Iberian Peninsula and going all the way down the coast of Africa, seeking the sources of commodities that they were looking for: fishing grounds, gold, ivory, pepper, and slaves that North Africans had long tapped by their overland caravan trade with sub-Saharan Africa. By 1475, the Portuguese had passed the equator to reach the powerful and prosperous West African kingdom of Benin. At first, the Portuguese practiced a kind of hit-and-run raids for plunder, but they faced formidable African resistance. Superior guns and ships enabled them to dominate coastal trade, but that couldn't overcome the superior numbers on land. So to procure the commodities they wanted after 1450 or so, the Portuguese began negotiating with African rulers for commercial treaties. The standard pattern of Portuguese empire building became one of establishing fortified posts at points all along the trade route, along the African coast, which they would defend fiercely on sea, but mostly defend from rival Europeans. In this way, over the next 100 years, the Portuguese built a rope-like coastal empire around Africa and then into the Indian Ocean, which was the initial and ultimate goal of these explorations. Meanwhile, as the Portuguese were doing this, some important developments were taking place back at the starting line, those islands that were initially conquered as part of this expansion: the Canaries, the Azores, and the Madeiras. First, the Portuguese having practiced a more extensive mode of colonization on the islands. So these islands were surrounded by rich fisheries and heavily forested with trees that yielded valuable dyes, and they returned immediate profits that provided harbors and bases from which to launch their future voyages. On these islands, the Portuguese began practicing something that we call settlement. That is, the Azores and Madeiras were uninhabited lands, but the Canary Islands had a population of about 30,000 of people known as the Guanche. The Guanche were descended from North African Berbers, but after immigrating to the islands in 2000 BCE, they lost contact with the continent, developed their own culture, raising pigs, goats, and sheep, cultivating wheat, beans, and peas. But they had no metalwork and they used stone tools. Furthermore, the Guanche were not politically united, but divided into rival chieftainships over 7 major islands. They resisted Portuguese settlement, which then served as a pretext for enslavement and forced labor on sugar plantations. So, conditioned by the Reconquista, Iberians believed that the Guanche deserved to be enslaved because they were neither civilized nor Christians. As the Portuguese king wrote to the Pope, the Guanche were, quote, like animals, because they had, quote, no contact with each other by sea, no writing, no kind of metal or money. So we see immediately what I started with at the beginning of this video: a sense of cultural superiority, a sense of judgment and value judgment of Europeans on the societies that they would encounter in terms of what they had and didn't have, and the Europeans defining themselves in terms of this superiority which justified conquest. The technology that the Europeans had, some of which was only recently developed, was seen as proof of their own superiority. So we see on this island a pattern that we're going to see repeated again and again and again as part of the conquest of the Americas. That is, enslavement of the peoples, indigenous peoples, forced labor, plantation style slavery, when disease causes the Guanche to die off. They're replaced with Africans. The islands are deforested, and the training ground. This becomes the training ground for the invasion of the Americas. In fact, the indigenous peoples of the Canary Islands were within a couple decades extinct through this process of colonization. In addition, the exploitation of the islands inspired the search for more such islands on the horizon. So they begin to do probing further and further into the Atlantic, looking for possible islands like these to conquer. The second important event took place on the peninsula with the marriage in 1469 of Prince Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, which combined the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile to form a new political unit that they called Spain. Zealous, fiercely ambitious, and expansionist, Ferdinand and Isabella were kind of the crusader mind, this mindset that we've been talking about that had emerged over these 500 years of interaction with the Muslim world. And their zeal and ambition would come together with the figure of Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus, real name Cristoforo Colombo or Cristobal Colon, depending on if you're saying it in Italian or Spanish, was from Genoa. He was a talented navigator and mariner, trained as a sailor. Popular histories and films have long depicted him as a kind of modern man, a secular man dedicated to humanism and exploration and scientific discovery, who helped bring Europe out of the Middle Ages. In fact, he was a devout and militant Catholic of this kind of crusader type, who drew on the Bible for some of his geographical theories. He lusted after Asian riches, and he dreamed of converting people of Asia to Christianity to assist them in a final crusade against Islam. As early as 1484, Columbus was building on Portugal's history with the Atlantic with a scheme to travel westward. Contrary to popular myth, 15th century European intellectuals did not think the earth was flat. They knew that it was round. In fact, the ancient Greeks knew almost exactly how large the globe was. But Columbus greatly underestimated the size of the globe, and so believed that Japan was perhaps only 3,500 miles across the Atlantic, which was doable. So his goal was to sail westward and make it to Asia, bypassing all the routes, bypassing the whole run around Africa. Anyway, famously, nobody would fund his expedition until his ambitions came together with the Spanish monarchs, and on 3 ships with 90 men, he followed the route to the Canary Islands, and then he sailed out west and hit land in just 33 days. And this brings us up to the point of the invasion of the Americas.